All right, I wanted to thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm really excited to continue the conversation that the Zimroth Center had last year and started off talking about wrongful convictions and prosecutorial misconduct. The conversation that we started last year was outside of New York City and focused on Philadelphia, and I'm really looking forward to tonight's conversation, which is going to bring this full circle and talk about New York. You all should have pamphlets with their speaker's bio, so I'm not going to read their full extensive bio. But just to let you know, this is about a conversation about Dan Slepian's book, The Sing Sing Files, which highlights the stories of 6 men who were wrongfully convicted and the real-world consequences and, frankly, the devastation that flowed from the prosecutorial and police misconduct that led to these wrongful convictions. I'm going to start in the middle with Eric. This is Eric Glisson. He is one of the men who's profiled in the Sing Sing Files. In 1995, he was wrongfully convicted of murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. In 2012, he was exonerated after spending years fighting to clear his name. He was able to obtain exculpatory evidence that implicated other suspects in the crime. To his left is Celia Gordon, who is a senior ADA in the Conviction Review Unit at the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office. Before that, however, she spent most of her career as a defense attorney. And one of her clients is J.J. Velasquez, who was wrongfully convicted of murder and also sentenced to 25 years to life. J.J.'s story is also profiled in the Sing Sing Files. And we're excited to hear, I think, from Celia, because she's going to talk not just about JJ and her experience there, but also the work that she's doing now in Brooklyn. And last but not least is Dan Slepian, who's a journalist at NBC News, where he produces, among other things, Dateline. He has spearheaded dozens of investigations and documentaries that have helped solve cold cases and assisted in exonerating wrongfully convicted people, including the men profiled in the Sing Sing Files. And he continues to work with incarcerated people at Sing Sing Prison, where he recently helped create a video, Voices from Within, featuring testimonials designed to reduce gun violence. So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us. Thanks for being here. It's an intimate group. Let's have an intimate conversation. I know we're here to talk about wrongful convictions, but I actually would like to talk about that and broaden the topic a little bit as well. I'm going to start with this story. Because it's through the prism of wrongful convictions, through meeting Eric and JJ and the others, that really melted the ice for me and poked a hole in Pandora's box to see the horrors of mass incarceration as a whole. Rachel Barco helped me do that through her book as well. And so we'll get to Eric's story in a minute, and I think it's important that you hear Eric's story. But I just want to start with a story that's happening right now. 2 years ago, I met a man at the Innocence Conference by the name of Andre Brown. Andre was convicted in the Bronx in 2000. He was accused in 1999 of shooting during a robbery 2 men. Nobody died. It was an attempted murder. The only eyewitness really was a stranger who said she saw the shooting through her windshield at a stoplight. Andre maintained his innocence from the first day. There's a whole host of reasons that point to the fact that he's innocent, without going into that detail, because his innocence here is not the issue, and that's kind of the point. His lawyer was a guy named Thomas Lee, who was a mob lawyer for the Bonanno crime family, and actually was the first lawyer in American history to go into federal witness protection when he turned against the Bonanno crime family. While Andre was awaiting trial, he was in Rikers Island, and the day before trial, there was a note put on the witness's windshield with a bullet that said, "Rats die when they testify." Remember, his attorney was a mob lawyer. The judge was so upset by that witness tampering that he would not delay the trial. And the witness's grand jury testimony was read into the record, and she never appeared. She was never cross-examined. He was found guilty, and the judge sentenced him. Remember, there was no dead body. The judge sentenced him to 2 20-year concurrent terms, not consecutive. Or is it the other way around? Consecutive at the same time. Anyway, he got basically 40 years, which is what he would not have gotten today, obviously. He served 23 years of that sentence. He rekindled with his high school sweetheart while he was in prison. He had a baby who's now 14 years old. Had never been convicted of a crime before. 2 years ago, when I met him at the Innocence Conference, which I'm actually going to tomorrow, and I'll see him there, his conviction was overturned that year for ineffective assistance of counsel. He came home to his family after 23 years, his loving wife, his son is a basketball star at 14 years old, a straight A+ student. Started working for a judge in New Rochelle, mentoring at-risk youth. He became a pillar of his community. 3 months ago on Christmas Eve, he gets a letter from the appellate court that his conviction was being reinstated, that they overturned the vacatur of his conviction. In 2 weeks from now, he's scheduled to drive himself back to prison for 18 years. When you think about a story like that, I don't really care about his innocence or guilt. The question is what's the purpose of incapacitation? What's the purpose of prison? What service does it do to us for public safety to send him back? It's going to cost us a couple $1 million in tax money. Who cares, really, right? That's not the point, but why? What's it going to do to his son? When JJ, who was mentioned as in my book, used to write me letters. I visited JJ more than 250 times in prison. He wrote me letters when I met his sons when they were 5 and 8. They're now 30 and 27. He would write me letters when his son was 11. Dan, please help. My son is going off the tracks. I'm not home to help him. Was he predicting the future? He was, because his son went to prison. Is that a surprise? No. What's going to happen to Andre's son? What's going to happen to all those at-risk youth that he mentors as a credible messenger when he says to them, you can be me. There are second chances. What are those at-risk youth supposed to think now? How does this decision benefit society? I bring that up because this issue that we're talking about wrongful conviction, is a very singular, specific issue with a guy like Eric, who was kidnapped from society, completely kidnapped from society, thrown in a cage for 18 years for something he clearly didn't do. But as pathological as all of these things these things with Andre, right? Why does it help? You can say the same thing about what happens to wrongful convictions. And that's really, to me, the similar thing about this whole system, this moral stain on our society that, in my view, 200 years from now, future generations are going to look back at the way we look at slavery, because everything we're doing doesn't make any sense. So how does it make sense when you have evidence of innocence for a guy like Eric and you say it's a bottle of water and a prosecutor will tell you that's an elephant? So that's become my focus. Like, how do we get past that? With Eric's story, and then you can hear from Eric. And by the way, Celia's a hero, because with JJ's story, when I found evidence of innocence, I had nowhere to turn. We weren't ready to do a story. This is back in 2010. And when Celia was a defense attorney, she took on JJ's case and really helped get him out of prison. JJ introduced me to Eric. I was on a visit one day to Sing Sing to visit JJ. And he said, it was June of 2012. And he said, you got to see this guy, Eric. Listen, he's innocent. So the next day I visited Eric. Eric was one of six people who did not know each other, that were all convicted together in the Bronx. There was a murder of a cab driver by the name of Bath Diop in 1995, in January of 1995. And it was January, right? Yeah. January 16th, I believe. Anyway, it doesn't matter. January 19th, I like to be precise. January of 1995, a cab driver was shot. And just a few hours earlier, before that, a FedEx executive a few blocks away, about a mile away, was killed violently. She was handcuffed, socks were in her mouth, she was executed. Two totally different kinds of murders. One was a robbery, another was obviously clearly very personal. The only evidence that convicted Eric, the only 2 weeks after the crime, a drug-addicted, homeless sex worker said she saw 6 men, 6 people. Actually, at the time, she said she saw a bunch of people from her bathroom window, heard what they said, saw what they stole, saw what they did. The problem is that I went to where she lives to see what she could see. And there's no possible way she could have seen what she said she saw. The bigger problem is that the detective never did that. And what Eric was originally charged with both murders, because what happened is that the lead detective, his name was Mike Donnelly, had a mentor named Tom Aiello. It was the last case of his career, Tom Aiello. It was Mike Donnelly's second case of his career. Mike Donnelly was the young detective. Tom Aiello, the veteran. Tom Aiello had the FedEx murder case. The younger one, Mike Donnelly, had the cab driver case. So Mike Donnelly gets a tip. He arrests a teenager, a young boy, 15 years old, and the boy says, "There's a woman staying at my house who knows something about that cab driver shooter." So they go over to the 15-year-old boy's house, and that's where the sex worker is staying on his couch, right? Mike Donnelly doesn't speak Spanish. She didn't speak English. So the 15-year-old boy's sister, the detective asked her to serve as the translator. And that girl's name was Kathy Gomez. And Kathy said that, okay, she saw these people, she knew Eric from the neighborhood, whatever. But by the time the detective Donnelly left the house, Kathy Gomez was not only a translator. Apparently, she said she knew information not only about the cab driver murder, but she said she heard the same people talking about the FedEx murder. And based on that, and nothing but that, Eric and 5 other people were arrested for both murders. By the time Eric went to trial, the case against the FedEx murder was dropped, and he and a woman named Kathy Watkins, who he had never met before, to this day, he's never said a word to her. They were convicted together and sentenced to 25 years to life. The other 4 faced murder charges and went to trial for both murders. By the time they went to trial, Kathy Watkins, that 16-year-old, said she didn't want to testify. She tried. It's in the court record. She tried to kill herself instead of testifying, and we now know the reason why. Because the detective told her what to say and wrote her statement for her. In fact, she never read the statement because she didn't read English. And in that statement, it says that she saw both. She says she never saw anything, and that she told the detective that, and that he would have her arrested if she didn't testify. So, just based on this one single eyewitness 2 weeks after the crime, this woman, Kathy Gomez, did not testify in the other case, only in Eric's case. And they were convicted, and all 6 went away for 25 to life in 1995. Now, here gets the really crazy part. In 2003, a U.S. attorney's investigator, great guy, named John O'Malley, is taking down a gang in the South Bronx. Eric and the 5 others have already been away in prison for 7 years. Now, most of you probably know the Queen for a Day as a proffer, the federal system, where you have to admit everything you've done, you sentence, whatever. So he's taking down these gang members from the Bronx, and one of them confesses, we shot this cab driver on Crows Avenue in Lafayette. They give an intersection in January of 1995. Admits it, tells them where the crime happened. We think we killed him. Gilbert Vega, me and Joey did it. John O'Malley and another detective from the NYPD, Pete Forselli, both separately, 3 different times, contact the 43rd Precinct. And each of them are told each time, we have no record of a crime or a murder in that area. Meanwhile, there's 6 people in prison for it. They go to federal court, and during their plea allocution, Gilbert and Joey, the federal prosecutor says, Your Honor, we have both of them admitting that they shot a cab driver. We can't find a body. We don't find a crime. So they're going to plead guilty of a shooting in the commission of a robbery because we don't know that there's a murder. The judge actually says, well, I hope the man didn't die. And the prosecutor says, well, we think he got it. We don't know. They were told there's no murder. So those 2 pled guilty to the same crime in 2003, while 6 other people were doing time in New York State for it. So now 8 people were responsible when the only eyewitness from a bedroom window during the shooting said they saw 2 men run away. It was Gilbert and Joe, we now know. From his prison cell, this man who went to prison with a 6th grade education, he dropped out of school in 6th grade. He got himself an education in prison. He learned the language used to lock him up. He never stopped writing letters every day to anybody that would listen. And nobody listened. Everybody said thanks, but no thanks are never even answered. Most never even answered. He files freedom of information requests. He files all sorts of fighting every day. Finally, he gets a freedom of information request of the phone record of the cell phone that was stolen from the cab driver minutes after he was shot. I mean, this guy is getting redacted files in his cell, holding them up to the light to see phone numbers and names. And from his prison cell, he figures out that those phone numbers come back to Gilbert Vega, who had pled guilty. He writes a letter. He goes to the law library, and he finds out from the inside that this guy Vega and Joey, from inside Sing Sing, they were part of this gang called Sex, Money, Murder. That was the gang John O'Malley was taking down. So Eric finds out the name of the prosecutor responsible for Sex, Money, Murder. Her name is Helen Cantwell. Dear Miss Cantwell, my name is Eric Glisson and I'm innocent. I believe his 10,000th letter. He sends it. U.S. Attorney's Office puts it in the mail. A stamp that he had to pay for. He gets paid 14 cents an hour in prison. That letter shows up at the U.S. Attorney's Office, but there's a problem. Helen Cantwell had left the office. Luckily for Eric, John O'Malley, that investigator by now, is in that office. He's the chief investigator, and he had said to the secretary, if there's ever a letter or anything comes in about a murder, give it to me, because he's like a savant. You know, he knows the names of every gang member, every murder, everything. You know, John. So she says, okay, and she remembered that, and just as easily could have put that letter in a waste paper basket and thrown it away. She put it on John O'Malley's desk. He opens it up. He sees Crows Avenue in Lafayette, and he says, holy shit. Gilbert and Joey have been in federal prison for this since he had no idea. He drives up to Sing Sing, sees Eric, and apologizes to him. And it took another 4 months for Eric to get out. That's, believe it or not, that's in a nutshell Eric's story. He owes his freedom to himself. He got himself an education in prison. And after serving 18 years in a box, I tell him every day, I'm still waiting for the other shoe to drop. He is the most positive, loving, incredible man, and he's family to me. And I think that you should hear a little bit from him about his experience.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Eric, and thank you for coming out to hear our story. I know it's not a story of happiness, but it's a story of struggle, and it's a story of tenacity, that regardless of what condition I was in, I drove within myself to get through it. A lot of people ask me, how did I do it? Well, I had to really take inventory of myself, because a lot of myself was telling me no. The justice system was telling me no. I was in there for the rest of my life. I had 25 years. Although I told the judge when he sentenced me that I wasn't going to do 25 years to life. He told me that was up to a parole board or an appellate division. But I knew that at some point, after writing all of those letters to all of these organizations and being told no, and sent to other organizations, that at some point I had to take it into my own hands. And as Dan said, I went to jail with a 6th grade education. But at the time, I was working in the law library, obtaining my paralegal certificate and learning sessions law, because I needed to study the legislator's intent of 12525 CPL, criminal procedure law, because I believe that the judge and the prosecutor didn't imply and interpret the statute to prosecute me. So I looked for every way to get out. I filed CPL 44010 motions. I even filed the writ of habeas corpus and attached nearly 2 inches of exhibits. And that was denied. That was the last straw for me, because I knew I wasn't going to get out until I found the real people who did it. I couldn't claim I was innocent. I had to show that I was innocent. And that's what's the problem about our justice system today. Because my case went to every court, every appellate division, every court of appeal, and even on the federal level. And they were all denied and overlooked. Because our problem with our criminal justice system through the appellate division is these judges don't actually read the arguments. And there's a lot of bias between the prosecutor's office and the defendant. And most of the time, after the first appellate process, you're left to go pro se. And therefore, most people give up. They just get compliant with the way the system is and go along every day. But you still have people who are in there who are fighting as well. And that's how you find out about them through the law library, because that's where the main hangout is for those who want to get their freedom. The others, you can see them in the yard playing baseball, basketball, lifting weights, doing gang activity, getting high, drinking. There's all sorts of things you can do in there except fight for your freedom, because there's a lot of roadblocks to get into the law library. You have only a certain amount of people that can go at a time, which is about 12 to 15 people. And in a prison with over 2,500 people, that's like a small pea in a pot. But I knew that I had to learn the law. At the time, I just had got my GED from doing self-study. And from that point on, I started to take a lot of self-inventory. I started to dig deep in myself because I knew I had a big fight going. And I had to confront a lot of my weaknesses that I met along the way in my journey with digging within myself. I had to get rid of them. I had to invite more positivity because I was in an environment that negativity was prevalent. All I seen was violence every day. With guards, with the residents there, it didn't matter. That whole place is just a place of gloom. And every day I lived a nightmare. But I fought and I had belief in myself from taking the inventory into myself because so much of my life was looking out at the world. I never took the time to quiet myself to dig and find my strengths. And that's where I found that I can do it regardless of what. Either if I die in here, I'm going to try. And so I began to get into the college program. They had Mercy College there, so that was much of a distraction from the law library. But getting a college education there gave me a different outlook on life. It gave me a brighter side to look for instead of what was before me. I was able to look over that and see a brighter life and a better place for myself. So I worked on my law. I wrote tons and tons of letters. At every turn, I was denied. Denied. And at some point, you want to give up because your life every day is so volatile, you don't want to go through those emotions no more. They highs and lows. But when I started doing freedom of information requests, that gave me more power because I was able to get more information into my case as opposed to what was given to me. They only give you minimum of your documents, like in terms of DD-5 statements and other material related to it. But those FOIA requests was getting me closer to freedom because at every turn I was given a new piece of information. And with just looking at my wall of hope that had other individuals that was priorly released from being unjustly convicted, I had all of their newspaper articles there, and I looked at it every day, and that was my wall of hope. And one day I made it. I made that wall for somebody else. And so I'm proud of what I did, but I'm not proud of the experience and the stages I had to go through. I'm not proud of what the district attorney's office made me do, even though they knew that I was innocent. They made me wear an ankle monitor. And as I told you, I was in college there. But 2 days after I got out, I was back in the campus. And I had 9 classes left to finish my bachelor's in behavioral science. So, being that I was wearing that ankle monitor, I thought that I would have to spend several semesters. So I wrote a letter to the president, and I asked if I can do those 9 classes in 1 semester. She allowed me, and I was able to graduate 3 months after I was released. So they took the monitor off me, and it felt a lot better. It felt like a weight was just, a ton was released from me. And that gave me better, it left me in a better condition to reacclimate back into society. And society's great. You guys are very concerned about what's going on. You're very aware that we do have a problem with our justice system. And I'm just grateful that you're here and you have that passion to see change.
Now, it's odd to introduce Celia as a district attorney, because to me, she's not only my friend, but she's also my freedom fighter defense attorney when it came to JJ. But just to give you a sense, for those I'm sure many of you know, but you know, what Eric represents, his innocence, is a thimble in an ocean of injustice. You know, there are now, I guess, less than 2 million people in prison, but nearly a couple million people in prison. And my friend Barry Scheck, who started the Innocence Project, tells me that he believes that the most conservative estimates suggest that roughly 5% of the prison population could be innocent. I've never been a mathematician, but I do know by now that that number is about 100,000 people. If that's true, and anecdotally, you know, all these guys I met were in Sing Sing. Can't swing a dead cat in Sing Sing without finding an innocent person. If that's true, and it's just 100,000 people and not more, which it could be, while we're here right now, in 40 years, like 3,700 people, 3,000, less than 4,000 people have been exonerated. So if it's that many right now, we have a real crisis, a real epidemic. I mean, mass incarceration is its own epidemic and it's its own crisis. But within that, obviously, no one who's innocent should be in prison. And so that's its own crisis. So with that, you have thousands and thousands of people who are telling the truth that they're innocent, reaching out to people like Celia in your office, saying, help us, and there's only so many of you. How do you deal with that fire hose?
So excellent question. So it is always so odd for me I've been speaking recently as a person who is now an assistant district attorney in the conviction review unit. And every time I introduce myself and I say I'm an assistant district attorney, I'm like, wait, who? Who is that? And I have to, credit, I always say Dan and JJ changed the trajectory of my career drastically. I was a defense attorney for 18 years and fighting the good fight and absolutely loved the work that I did. And I stopped practicing for a little while because I had 3 kids I thought I should meet as a trial lawyer. I hadn't really met them very much. And when it was time for me to go back to work, I said, full time, I was teaching law, and I said I want to get back to it, but I really don't want to just go back to practicing law in the same way that I was, because having been involved in JJ's case changed me, like as a person, as a lawyer. And I said, I want to just work on wrongful conviction cases. But one thing that I learned as a defense attorney is that is a very difficult thing to do because you also need to pay your bills. And when you're taking on wrongful conviction cases, they're not individuals that have the means to pay you. So you have to do that pro bono, which means that you also have to have another way to earn a living. And so you really, I was a private defense attorney. You could only really handle, a few of those cases, one really at a time. And JJ's case, took over a decade. So I said I would love to do this from the inside, and I would love to be someone who is working as a prosecutor in a conviction review unit, so that I have the power and that I have the control and I have the resources that I didn't have when I was fighting for JJ, and against a conviction. And I say against because that's what it felt like when I was his defense attorney. The conviction integrity unit in the Manhattan DA's office under Cyrus Vance, which is different from the current conviction integrity unit under Alvin Bragg, who finally exonerated JJ. But my experience in that office was brutal. And when we first went, I'll just give you a little bit of background in conviction integrity units. So they were something that really started back in 2000, the early 2000s. Santa Clara, I think, was the first conviction review unit. Dallas was the second. And those were really just, they kind of started based on DNA, right? We had DNA evidence now, and it was like we could, what?
Wasn't Dallas the first?
No, Santa Clara was the first, Dallas was the second. A lot of people make that mistake. But they started it because there was DNA evidence all of a sudden, right? So these district attorneys' offices started their units, and they proactively were looking at cases to see if convictions had been, that they had the wrong person based on the DNA. Over time, more conviction review units started to come to be, and Manhattan, in 2010, they started a conviction review unit under Cyrus Vance. And I was representing JJ at the time, and we thought, this is amazing, right? We can like bring this case that is so ripe for an exoneration to this conviction integrity unit, because of course that's what they're there for. They want to do the right thing. And our experience was anything but that. And we, our very first meeting with them, we had submitted a written submission that was about, like a foot deep. And when we walked into our meeting, the very first meeting, the ADA who tried the case was sitting at the table flipping through our submission. And so, our understanding was that this is supposed to be an objective investigation, and that is anything but objective. And if you read Dan's book, you know what happened after that. And, and it just was one thing after the next, doors slamming in our face, in essence. And really, the unit was not designed to really legitimately take another look at this case. And it was really felt like the work that they did was really to protect the conviction. And so in deciding that I wanted to go back to work and do this type of work, when I was thinking about where would I love to work, I thought, if you know anything about conviction review units, Brooklyn is really the kind of the gold standard in this type of work as far as district attorneys' offices go. And they actually exonerate people. And even when I was representing JJ, I can't tell you the amount of people that would constantly send me the news articles of people being exonerated in Brooklyn. And it would make me crazy, because I would say, there was less reason to exonerate that person than JJ. And if this had only been in Brooklyn, he would have been out years ago. And that was maddening. And so interestingly enough, Dan sent me a text one day, and he said, look who's hiring. The Conviction Review Unit in Brooklyn was looking for an ADA to add to their unit. And I closed my office door, and I immediately applied to this position, interviewed, and come to find out, Brooklyn had not hired, they had no defense attorneys on their staff. And it was all career prosecutors, and that was kind of their, and still kind of is their philosophy, that they want to have career prosecutors in the office because they really understand the way the prosecutor's offices work. And also because a lot of times we're having conversations with the ADAs who tried the cases, and so they wanted it to be, not this like us versus them, this former defense attorney coming and saying, you did it all wrong. And the feeling that if it was a former prosecutor having these conversations, that it would be a little bit easier to deal with within the office. And so I was like this unicorn that came to them and said, nope, you need to hire me, and here's why. And so much to my happiness, they took a shot on me. And so I am the lone defense attorney, former defense attorney in our unit. But what I will tell you...
And has not freed one person yet.
What?
Have you freed anybody yet?
Have I?
You just got there.
Personally? I will be there a year as of
I know.
Tuesday.
I'm kidding.
And so that's something also that I always have to defend myself to Dan doing this work, but
Don't drink the Kool-Aid. Don't drink the Kool-Aid.
In Brooklyn, so our unit, we have 10 assistant district attorneys in our unit. We have 2 designated detective investigators that only work on our cases. They don't work on any cases in the office that are any prosecutorial cases. We have 3 paralegals. We have 2 interns at all times. So we have a pretty robust staff for conviction review units. And one of the things about conviction review units, I think that is vital, is that like our staff, although all but me are former prosecutors, there are only 3 people in our unit that have spent their careers in the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office, 2 of whom, one of whom spent all of her career in appeals, so not prosecuting cases, and the rest are all from other district attorneys' offices. And I think that's important because when we always joke, like when we get a new case and somebody will say, well, who is the prosecutor? And I'm like, I have no idea. I haven't retained that information because I don't know these people. And really not a lot of people in our office do. I think it's important to have a few people that have been there because they know the culture, they do know people within the office, and that's an important component. But certainly to have a mixture of people is important. And so getting back to, what was your question for me again that you initially asked me?
The fire hose.
The-
What do you choose?
Yeah.
I'm asking you, and I don't, because I haven't figured it out myself.
Yeah, so how do you, so the interesting thing about doing this work, I think, is that, in a perfect world, they would all be Eric Lisson's, J.J. Velasquez's, David Lemus's, who we, get the case and we're like, oh my God, this is so egregious, right? And it's really just not that simple. So our standard for taking a case is pretty low. Like the bar is pretty low as far as the cases that we will agree to look at. The person they apply to our office, and it could be we have a very simple application that the person who's incarcerated can, on their own, they don't need a lawyer, they can just fill out our application. It's very basic. Or sometimes they'll come through an innocence project or a private attorney or legal aid. And our standard is basically, they have to be able to state a basis for, exoneration. So if what they say is true, for example, I was coerced into confessing, my confession was false, the eyewitnesses, the eyewitnesses have recanted, some basis for their exoneration that, if it were true, would be a reason to exonerate. And then there has to be a means by which we can investigate that claim. So if they say, I have an alibi, my alibi was Jane Smith, but Jane Smith is deceased, well, that would not be a case that we would be able to take on because we have no means to investigate that. And so once we take on a case, then it gets assigned to one of us, and then the investigation starts. And our first investigation starts with the file itself. So, and this is where it really is, it was coming into a prosecutor's office after spending my entire career as a defense attorney was a very interesting introduction. Like, I can request a file, right? I can just get the file and everything that's in the file, which is, really, it's an incredible thing to be able to do. Yeah. And, especially having been on the other side, not ever knowing if I truly had everything that existed. And so now, I can get the file, I can request the detective's files, I can, I can look and see who the witnesses are, I can get background checks done on people that I want to speak with, and and I can follow up on leads maybe that weren't followed up on in the initial investigation. I can see what was done, what wasn't done, and that process is so time consuming. And so to Dan's question, like, how do you decide and what do you do? I have right now 7 active investigations, and it's each one is incredibly time consuming. And and each one comes with just like twists and turns. And I have a case that I'm currently working on, and I was ready to close the case because I felt like really I'd reached a dead end. There was really nothing left to investigate. And I went back and listened to an interview that I did of a witness, and when in listening to it, I was like, wait a second, she lied to me about that. And that one thing has changed the entire investigation because it caused me to do additional things, which then led to other things and other things, and compounded. And so these cases really sometimes, they take on lives of their own, and we go out and speak to every person in person. So we meet with witnesses in person. We don't ask witnesses to come to our office. if we can avoid that. We go out, we look for them. I am out with the detectives all the time, knocking on doors, trying to find people, interviewing them in other states. We go all across the country and internationally. I have a colleague who was in the Dominican Republic a few months ago looking for someone. We didn't even know if that person was still there, but we were looking for them. And so, our office, we're very fortunate because it gives us the resources to do this. And that's another thing that...
So Celia's describing an office that sounds like it works. My experience is that most conviction integrity units are what Alvin Bragg called during his campaign CRINOs, conviction review in name only, which is they're there because they're supposed to be there, but it's just kind of an appendage to the office, and it's a program, and no one really thinks about it very much. And so for this epidemic that we're talking about, or that I'm talking about, that I believe that exists, the question is, moving forward, and it's a very difficult answer, I don't know if there is an answer, is what do we do? How do we get people to pay attention? How do we get people to understand there's confirmation bias and tunnel vision? How do we get people to question their own belief system? It's interesting, and I'd like to, it's a small group, let's chat, whatever you want to talk about, but my book was about these 6 guys and the criminal legal system and what I've witnessed over 20 years. And as I finished it and I read it, I was like, you know what? This is a real call to action. It's a real call to action to do something about criminal justice reform. But in the past few months, I've been feeling, as I'm rereading sections and thinking about it, I'm seeing themes in my own book that I never even realized. And it pertains to all of us. And it hit me because endlessly people say to me, I can't believe what you did, and you stuck with these guys for so long, and it's extraordinary, and always makes me uncomfortable. Always has made me uncomfortable, people saying that to me. And there's 2 reasons. One of the reasons is I feel like Eric and JJ and the others have done so much more for me than I ever have for them. Eric is my brother. I love him to death. I would throw myself in front of a train for him. But there's something else recently that hit me about this. What I did should not be considered extraordinary. Seeing each other, paying attention to each other, standing up for what's right, fighting for the rule of law, should be the most ordinary, normal thing to do. We should all be doing it. It shouldn't feel extraordinary. I was following breadcrumbs. Spent a long time doing it. But we should all be doing something, because the times that we're living in right now, deep division, arguably misinformation is more profitable than information. Political division, most of all fear. People feel disenfranchised. All of us do. What do? Talk about a fire hose, right? There's a fire hose every day, millions of them coming at us. And I think no matter what side of the political spectrum we sit on, we can all agree that government isn't working so well, and they're not looking out for us. And so the only answer is us. The only answer is you don't need to be a journalist. You don't need to care about this issue. You need to have a voice and a gut and empathy. And if you have that, use it, because that's how we change the world.
Can I add something to that? So I think that part of, that when we look at Dan's stories on Dateline, and we meet people like Eric and people like JJ, it's easy to feel outrage and to say, this is just like horrible. And as a human, on a human level, we can relate to that. what I see in the work that I do, like I said, I wish, I wish it was as simple as just looking and seeing this is a really, a squeaky clean person that has been incarcerated for something they didn't do. And I think where there's like a disconnect is that a lot of people who are in prison and don't belong there, they also have long records. And that doesn't mean that they should be incarcerated wrongfully. And I think, there's like this kind of complacency. Well, they have a rap sheet a mile long, and so if they didn't do it, well, they probably deserve to be there anyway. The majority of cases that I have been exposed to in this work that I'm doing are people that are living very different lives than I would venture to guess most people in this room. And I feel like those are, there's like this kind of feeling like, well, but who cares, right? They were incarcerated before, and I think that it's important that we recognize that, wrongful convictions are wrong. It doesn't matter what their background is. It doesn't matter what they look like. It doesn't matter what they've done before. If they did not commit the crime that they have been convicted of, they don't belong there.
Right. Obvious statement, right?
You would think.
But there's a lot of people in prison who did do the crime that don't belong there. Prisons are full of really, really good people. Really good people that made really bad mistakes when they were like 18 to 23 or something, when they were young. Really, really good. I mean, there's bad people that do bad things that should be away. And as a Dateline producer for 30 years, believe me, I've done stories about them. And I'm very happy that they're gone. But I've been to prisons hundreds and hundreds of days. I've met thousands of incarcerated people. And I'm a witness to tell you that the vast majority of people are really decent, good people whose trauma in prison has actually made them more emotionally intelligent and made them better people. So we have these tropes of society, what we believe is intuitive. Everybody in prison says they're innocent. Wrong. Like more than 90% of the people I've met in prison admit their guilt for the crime for which they were. Now they might minimize their involvement, and yes, some innocent people I'm innocent, I lie, but there's far too many telling the truth. But I guess the point that I was making before about this book and about this movement and about this time that we're in, for me, it's people like Eric. And it's learning everything I can still learn, thanks to people like Rachel and others, about what is the objective data so we can make decisions not from an emotional place, but from an objective, academic, intellectual, thoughtful, critical thinking place that just happens to be my bag. But for everybody else, whatever your bag is, these times right now require every single one of us to do something. No matter what you do, you have to do something. And so that, to me, is my takeaway from this book, more than criminal justice system. Does anybody want to talk about anything? Yeah.
One thing I think that the DA's offices need to do is that they need to prosecute cops who engage in the type of egregious misconduct that you talked about. Leaning on a witness and having them fabricate, an eyewitness statement is completely outrageous, and anybody who has any sense would say it's a crime. And we had a program here about a year ago, and Larry Kraftner was here from the DA's office. I asked a question about prosecuting cops who engage in that, and they said that it's almost non-existent.
It is non-existent for the most part. Michael Morton's case in Texas was one of them.
And that, you can't have, deterrence of the police without prosecuting the police. I do Section 1983 civil rights litigation. I sue for money damages. And that has some deterrent effect, but it's very small.
But qualified immunity doesn't even allow you.
Qualified immunity, and then they're indemnified anyway. So they don't pay out of their own pockets in almost every jurisdiction.
It's the citizens that pay.
So I would hope that, progressive district attorney's offices take a really hard look at creating actual deterrence against officers who do that sort of thing. There's that famous detective Scarcella, who
Scarcella is, for those who don't know about Scarcella, former detective of Brooklyn, responsible for a couple dozen, if not more, false confessions. You have already paid his victims more than $115 million in compensation. He's not only free living in Brooklyn right now, he still collects his pension from the NYPD. You know, you mentioned Larry Krasner. We did a story, Lester Holt and I did a story a few years ago about a guy named Walter Ograd in Philadelphia. And I thought that story was to bed. We had a week to air. Thank God I was home. And that morning, Larry Krasner calls and said, the detective was Marty Devlin, who I know Patricia Cummings was here last year, and she was the one that I did that story with. But Marty Devlin was the detective who got the false confession. And that morning, Larry Krasner called and said, we're going to arrest Devlin today for perjury on another case. And I break the show open that night. I was like, you couldn't tell me yesterday? But to the extent that someone was held responsible, in my personal experience over 30 years, that's as far as it's gotten. You know, and I know that this is the case with Michael Morton in Texas, but that's like everyone, Barry Sheck always talks about. That guy went to, what, 3 months or something? He went to prison, the prosecutor. So there is no accountability. It just doesn't exist. I don't know how, and I don't think it's ever going to come, to be honest.
You know, and the question is always, you know, one question that's raised with CRUs is like, what is the responsibility of the CRU when we find prosecutorial misconduct, let's say, or, you know, police misconduct? So, you know, and I can tell you in Brooklyn, I think we're the only office that that we publish a report, a very extensive, like there's sometimes 70, 80-page reports that detail the initial investigation, the pretrial, the trial, the appellate process, and then the CRU investigation. And we like in great detail discuss what was done and what the CRU found, and call out prosecutorial misconduct, detective misconduct. We don't name the names, and the reason for that is, and I know Dan's like gonna mock me, but
Kool-Aid.
But the reason for that is that the objective of the CRU is to get people out of prison, and we are in this world of, you know, I mean, it's just in the last like 10 years, really, that this is, CRUs are even a thing. And even now, in all of the prosecutors' offices, in, you know, there's I think 96 CRUs, and of those, like, I think 44 of them have never exonerated anyone. So, I mean, we're still in the infancy stage of CRUs. And the things that I'm, like Dan said before, the things I'm telling you about what Brooklyn does, we're a machine compared to all of these other CRUs. And, you know, and even our office, we have 42 exonerations, you know, and a majority of those have just come within, you know, the recent years. So there's, because of Ken Thompson. And so it's you know, we're still at the beginning stages, and so our focus has to be to get people out of prison right now. And if we started to call out prosecutors by name in these reports, I can tell you there would be a chilling effect within the office. We would have probably lots of lack of cooperation, and, you know, and it would hinder, I think, the job that we have to do. So as far as, you know, now that's not to say that if there's prosecutorial misconduct, that's not then something that the district attorney himself can do something, right? That it's sort of, it's not the job of the CRU to do that, I think. But I'm not saying that that's not, you know.
She doesn't name them. I put them on TV, so we're good.
Yeah. So that's why that's why the world has Dan.
You know, during the past week, there's a measure now. You know, first of all, thanks to all of you for the critical work that you do. But during the past week, there's a measure now to streamline the discovery process endorsed by Governor Hochul and all the district attorneys in the state. So this is a question for Ms. Gordon, put on your defender hat for a moment. Is this likely to lead to more, unjustified convictions?
Is what? Streamlining discovery? It's interesting because when I was practicing as a defense attorney, we didn't discovery. What's discovery? We were handed a big pile, at trial, basically. And I think now things have moved in a good direction. I think with the discovery reform, we, as defense attorneys, they were given things, and then there's been pullback. I think we're still, I think, and I say we, I don't mean we, I mean defense, the defense bar, I think, is in a better situation today than they certainly were when I was practicing as a defense attorney. I know prosecutors have, there is a tremendous amount of work that has to be done now that never was before with respect to certifying cases for discovery. So, as a former defense attorney, I think that even with the pullbacks that there have been with the discovery reform, I think we're still ahead of the defense is still ahead of the game.
There was a J.J. Velasquez's case, who was a guy that I've known for more than 20 years. I visited him 250 times in Sing Sing over the years. I investigated his case for a decade. I did a story on Dateline in 2012. Was nominated for 3 Emmys. I say that not to pat myself on the back, just to say that the world of journalism saw it as an act of journalism. I proved his innocence. There was an original investigation and a prosecution. I put it on TV. The DA's office doubled down on his conviction for another decade. They did an alleged review under their conviction and review unit. They investigated me too, but that's besides the point. But, they come to their conclusion under a woman named Bonnie Sard, who was the head of that unit, and they write to the judge, we did a fair, thorough, comprehensive investigation of the case. And a judge writes that, and a guy like me looks at that as fact, because a judge said it. Well, not only did they not interview JJ's alibi witnesses, they never even called them on the phone, right? They didn't do a fair, thorough, objective evaluation of the case. The theory of the case was that it was a botched robbery, right? So in 2012, when I did my story, we proved his innocence. In 2014, they said we reviewed the whole case, there's nothing to see here. In 2018, a yellow envelope shows up on my mailbox with DD5s all unredacted from JJ's case. One is an absolute bombshell. Every single attorney I've shown it to, including former prosecutors, everybody agreed, including Bob Gottlieb, who was Celia's partner and JJ's lawyer at the time, was a textbook definition of a Brady violation. 2018, JJ goes, now this is after the trial. This is after the original investigation. This is after an alleged thorough, fair, comprehensive reinvestigation. Goes to court in 2018, nope, denied. Last year, JJ was just exonerated 5 months ago, 20 days after my book came out in 2024. I met him in 2002. Last year, when Alvin Bragg's office started reinvestigating the case, for the first time, there was an ethical, collaborative, open unit. As a result of that, I got more paperwork. Remember, it was a botched burglary, right? Handwritten notes from the detective, still in the file that I got a year ago, saying, oh, it was Lorenzo Woodford, who was one of the witnesses, said it was a contract hit on Al Ward for $5,000. All this information. He's already out and home. He's been exonerated. Why has that never been turned over? So I don't know about this streamlining discovery, but what I do know is that when people wear the uniform, wherever they are, whether you're a train conductor, whether you're a cop, That's the role you play. And when you're a prosecutor and you want to win, something happens in your mind. I don't know what it is. It's not bad, guys. It's not bad people. Maybe sometimes. But I don't think it's bad people most of the time because it's such a phenomenon nationally that something else is at play. There's tunnel vision, there's confirmation bias, there's something happening that doesn't allow people to turn over a piece of paper that might be deleterious to their own case because they believe they're right. And the system, for that reason, subtly and not so subtly, encourages these people with great power to act irresponsibly in ways that they don't even realize. So even if these laws are passed with this discovery, I'm not sure specifically what you're talking about, in practice or in law and writing it sounds good. In practice, I don't know.
I have a question, clarification. I thought I heard you say that the great majority of prisoners become better people, more emotionally aware. And how does that fit? I mean, I may just be out of date, but I thought that there had been a lot of studies showing that imprisonment, as we have it now, breeds recidivism.
That's a different issue. Have you ever been to a maximum security prison? No. Okay. So, and that's not a judgment, or I'm not saying bad girl for that. I don't mean it that way. That's good. It's good you've never been to prison. I'll answer this in two ways. One is I volunteered for many years and we're starting an organization called Voices from Within. It's for guilty people to redefine what it means to pay a debt to society. One of my friends from that group, his name is Dario Pena. Brilliant guy. He works at Columbia University right now. He was, I believe, 17 years old when he was arrested. And Dario's the kind of guy that doesn't say much, but when he talks, it's like, whoa, it's like this very philosophical thing. And we were in a meeting one day in Sing Sing when he was still locked up, and I said, what is it, people call you a killer. You are a murderer. You killed two people. Killed two rival gang members. He said, let me explain this to you. I was trying to go to school dodging bullets. My dad wasn't home. My mom was addicted to drugs. My brother was 8 years older, and he was in a gang. And I hung out with them, and they treated me well. I thought that was my family. I was a soldier in a war, and it was kill or be killed. And everybody knew the rules. And to him, when he killed two rival gang members, it was self-defense, and he got 25 to life. He was 17 years old. Then he goes away, and his brain continues to develop. And his frontal lobe develops when it's 25. And when he's 17, he didn't understand the consequences of what he did. And he goes to school, and he gets an education. And now he's 30. And he's ready to be a pillar of society to help other people not come to prison. But he still has another 10 years to go, right? That's at the beginning. I said the purpose of what we're doing. Is it punishment? Is it the Department of Punishment or the Department of Corrections? I'm about to get there. The Bureau of Justice Statistics did a study that followed more than 430,000 people when they got out of prison and found, as you're saying, an astonishing amount, 70+% recidivism rate, had some sort of interaction with the justice system. When people get an education in prison, by the way, that drops real low. When you have a master's degree, it's virtually 0%. But your question about why the recidivism rate is so high is not these people are bad people.
I didn't say they were bad people. You said that what happened in prison was that people grew emotionally, which almost seems like an advert for prison. The question is, what a lot of people say is that prisons miseducate people and make people worse people than when they came in because of the conditions of imprisonment. Not ideal conditions, not conditions where everyone...
Those two things are not mutually exclusive. Eric Glisson lived in a cage for 18 years. When it was hot, he had to lie on the floor bare with his back on the cement floor with his feet in the toilet to cool off. He had one spigot with cold water out of 200-year-old pipes in his sink that came out brown water. He filtered it in a sock. Those are bad conditions. He faced violence. He has a scar in the back of his head because he was stabbed. But his trauma elevated his psyche.
But does it do it for everyone? What percentage of people are Arabs?
Well, it can do it for everyone if everyone takes their own account of themselves. In prison, you can be reformed and change, or you can bring the same man home that left. It's up to you in there. It's the individual. The guards are not there to make you do anything. The guards wasn't there to make me go to school to continue my education. It was me that sat down on my bed in that cell and found that I needed to do something about myself. I didn't need anyone to look for me. Now, prison does have bad conditions, yes. And if it festers violence. But they do have other means that you can rehabilitate yourself. They have programs like RTA, Rehabilitation Through the Arts. I was a part of that program. There were volunteers that came from outside that were part of theater programs to give us some type of pride within ourselves to help us to build ourselves. And when you have people that's coming in that dedicate their own time for you, this person that society considers the lowest of the low, that actually does something for you. It makes you feel better that there's actually somebody that really cares. Because society tell you nobody cares about a prisoner. He's a convicted felon, lock him up and throw away the key. That's been our ideology since the 80s with the war on drugs. Remember Reaganomics and all of that, and Nancy, the war on drugs, and the frying pan with the boiling egg? Y'all remember those stories? I'm 50 years old, sorry, but I'm kind of old here. But I remember all of that. And they do have these programs. They have computer repair. They have small appliance repair, plumbing, electrician, carpentry, building maintenance, asbestos removal.
A lot of prisons don't have that. But you're right. You're right. Prisons do cause crime. The conditions of prison absolutely cause people to be more violent. Some people to be more violent. There's no doubt about it. And society makes it worse because whether you're guilty or whether you're innocent, when you get out and you want to be better, you can't get a job. You can't get a house. You can't get a loan.
President.
But then you don't
We
put
just
anybody-
elected a convicted felon, so that's kind of says it all. And the rise in racism is so, I mean, these people are just plain racist, running the government now. So what are our choices? I mean, last panel here, Miriam Krinsky's book, or 2 panels ago, and I was wanting to know from Eric if that book is in the library there, because it has many prosecutors who are interested in reform. And when Alvin was here, he said he only hires people who are on board with that last time he was here. I mean,
Well, Dan interviewed Mr. Bragg, and Mr. Bragg told him all sorts of things and gave him all sorts of promises. But when it came down for him to keep them, it was a different story. Now, the problem is you can have a prosecutor's office with every integrity review board involved. But it comes from the leadership. It comes from the top. Now, when I was released, fortunately, there was Ken Thompson, and he was running for Brooklyn DA. And a friend of mine, Jabbar Collins, called me and said that he wanted me to come help him campaign for Ken out in Brooklyn. And I said, is Ken the real deal? He said, yes. And coming from Jabbar, who also got his own self out, and I've witnessed get a lot of people out in there by working in the law library and doing their cases. And next thing you know, these guys is leaving. Their motions is being overturned. Their convictions are being overturned. So when Jabbar told me that, I flew out here to Brooklyn. We were going to different schools, campaigning outside, passing out flyers, telling the people, please vote for Ken. He's for the people. We believe in him, and you should believe in him as well. And Kim Thompson did keep his word. And that's one time that I really did have some belief in the justice system, that somebody really was breaking the norm, that it wasn't the status quo anymore, that a new narrative was being formed, that there was hope and justice, and that we could believe in it again.
Can I make my comment in a different way, please? I just want to make this in a different way so you understood what I meant. Sing Sing is one of the biggest prisons in America. I think it has the biggest cell block in America. 2 football fields long, 4 tiers high, cells on both sides. The first time you walk through it, it is an unforgettable experience. For example, like I have 2 dogs. I love them to death. Like I birthed them myself. I love my dogs. I remember walking through that cell block for the first time, thinking to myself, I literally would not board my dogs in the box that he lived in for 18 years. That's just the start of the horrors and the moral stain and the lack of human dignity that people face every minute, every second of every day in prison. It never goes away. My point is that I'm astonished how many people living in those conditions are able to rise above that, are able to be Eric Lisson, are able to have a sense of self, are able to not come back to prison. Even if the recidivism rate is so high, it's pretty astonishing in some ways that it's not even higher, given how difficult the system makes it. The system is the one that creates a lot of these problems, for sure. I just find it magical when I meet people like Eric and JJ and David Lemus and Dario Pena, Jermaine Archer. I can keep going on and on with names of people who have done decades of prison who become like a moral compass to me, who become my North Star. Eric is one of them. Some people aren't so lucky. They don't have the fortitude. They get out, they can't get a job, they get cows, and they get pissed off. They come out rageful and vengeful, and they kill somebody. That's the pathology of the system. That's what the system created. But what's magical to me is how many people have risen above that. That's what I mean by how surprised I am, by how much emotional intelligence and beauty and humanity that I have found inside those prison walls. I hope that's clear.
Right before COVID, in February of 2020, they, Sing Sing had a TED Talk. And so we were there, and there were like 15 or 16 guys who were incarcerated that did these TED Talks, which in and of itself, to do a TED Talk is an amazing feat. But under the conditions that they live in, to do a TED Talk was even more impressive. But it was such an incredibly moving experience. And the overall topic of the TED Talk was redefining what matters. And they all talked about redefining something. And many of these TED Talks, you can find them on YouTube. San Quentin, I think they had done it first. I was just told the other day I was at Bedford Hills, and the woman that I was speaking with there said they were supposed to do it right before COVID. But this is like another, it was such a wonderful experience, and you can find them on YouTube. There's one I just posted on my LinkedIn the other day too, Jermaine Archer, who has since been released and is now the director of RTA. And his was about redefining basically what 24 hours means. And he talked about how we all, whether we're incarcerated or not, we're living the same 24 hours in a day. And so what your life becomes is really dependent upon what you choose to do in those 24 hours. And he said how he would every day, he would make a to-do list. And he would say, I'm going to learn a language, I'm going to get my degree, I'm going to read this novel. And he said, and every day he would get back to his cell and he'd say, what did I do today? Well, I didn't do that, I didn't do that, I didn't do that. What did I do? I sat in the yard, I played checkers, I shot the shit, right? I didn't do any of the things on my to-do list. He said, so I started to make a do not list. I can't sit in the yard, can't play checkers, right? And then he learned languages and he went to school and he got his degree and he just changed exponentially as a human being.
I know this is over, we're ending now, but I just want to leave with this thought. This idea that society has, that I grew up believing, that there's us versus them. This idea that, like, we're the quote-unquote good people, the law-abiding people, and those big prison walls, behind those prison walls, we don't want to know about them. Those are the bad people. I played cops and robbers as a kid, right? That's what society generally, overwhelmingly, by a vast majority believes. And I write about this in my book. A couple of years ago, my wife Jocelyn and I were home on a Sunday, and she says, you want to get some burgers? And I say, sure. And there's a place called Blazer, about 5 miles away from us. It was a rainy night. And so I go to pick up the burgers. Something happened. I turned the wheel or whatever happened, I drove through a fence and I hit a tree. I was stunned. Loud noise. I get out of the car. Homeowner comes over. You okay? That was so loud. I'm okay. I was on a state county road, so state troopers showed up. Little did I know, the homeowner said to the cops, I think he's drunk. Next thing I know is I have flashlights in my eyes. Now, Joss and I had gone to brunch that day. I had a Bloody Mary earlier that day. I was nervous, especially given the work that I do. And I said, do I need a lawyer? And everybody got very tense. Jocelyn's behind the detectives, stop, He wanted me to take a breathalyzer. I took a breathalyzer. It was 0.0001, whatever. Everybody relaxed. I didn't get a ticket. The police were like, sir, just a bad turn of the wheel, rainy night, no problem. Glad you're okay. End of story, right? But it got me thinking about all those times I had a couple beers before I picked up a burger. Sometimes when I've had a drink before I've driven. What if there was a child playing behind that fence that day? What if I had taken a life that day? I'd be potentially looking at 25 to life. That doesn't make me a bad person. That makes me as someone who made a terribly bad choice that day. Yet, that would have been the weekend that society saw me as one of you. Society saw me as someone with a right to human dignity, to some other invisible line of decency, some wall that I deserved whatever I got. And I should be treated like crap. We need to start rethinking us versus them. It's all us. And even if we don't care about, quote unquote, them, it affects us. Because this is not only about punishment, this is about public safety first. And what we're doing by so many metrics is making ourselves less safe because of what we do, to your point. So that's how I'll end. You guys want to say anything else? Do anybody else have any other questions?
Are you going to get that guy out who's going back in 2 weeks?
I will see him tomorrow.
I mean, seriously, that's a question.
We've been really campaigning. Dan has actually been in touch with several high officials that can actually do something. But a lot of the culture today is they don't want to seem like they over-objected about something. So they don't want to look like it's about ethics.
I'm going to manifest it and say yes, he's going to stay out of prison. And Yeah, I mean, there's so many of these
All
cases.
speak it into existence.
There's
And
so
that's
many
what
of
I like
these.
to do. I like to speak things into existence.
Robert Robertson, I did 5 stories on a guy named Robert Robertson on Texas death row. Just did them with Lester Holt 2 months ago for Nightly News. He is autistic. He has been in prison for more than 20 years on death row in Texas for shaking his 2-year-old baby to death, shaken baby syndrome. We now know that that science is deeply flawed in many ways. That it's not good to shake a baby, but there's all sorts of differential diagnosis that cause the same effects as what they used to think was a single diagnosis of child abuse. What the detective and the medical examiner did not know before they arrested and convicted him was that his 2-year-old daughter had been to the hospital 50 times in 2 years, and she had a 104.5 degree fever 2 days before she died. He's the one that brought her to the hospital. He's autistic. The detective who arrested him knew none of this, and today regularly visits him on death row to try and get him out because he believes he's innocent. Yet Robert Robertson is on death row, waiting for another execution date as we speak. Russell Mays, another shaken baby case in Tennessee. The Tennessee District Attorney, Celia's counterpart in the Conviction Integrity Unit, her name is Sunny Eaton. They did 2 investigations out of dozens and dozens and dozens of requests. Russell Mays, I loved my baby. I'd never hurt my baby. They do an investigation. The medical examiner who said that that baby was shaken to death said, oh no, he had an isometric stroke or whatever it was. It was a medical. I was wrong, says the guy who put him in prison. The prosecutor's office goes to the judge and says, we were wrong. The DA's office is fighting to get him out. The judge won't let him out because the judge believed the testimony from 20 years ago instead. These cases, I could be here for weeks telling you these cases. One after another, after another, after another, where anybody with any sort of decency, common sense, intellectual honesty, and objectivity can look at a set of facts and say, oh yeah, it's a water bottle, not an elephant. But we're still with the elephants. To me, this is the next incarnation of the civil rights movement. It really is. And we're just scratching the surface. And all of us are going to be long gone before this is fixed the way it needs to be fixed, in my view. Right, Professor Barco? That was a glum note to end on. What's that?